before there were queens or kingdoms, before there were mothers or daughters, before there were even names for the feelings that move through a woman's heart like winter wind through pine trees. There was ice, and there was fire. Listen now, as the mist rises from dark waters, as the first light of dawn touches the edges of a world so ancient that time itself was still learning to count the years. In the beginning, when the cosmos was nothing but empty space called Jinnun Gargab, when silence was the only sound and darkness the only light, something stirred in the void. From the north came ice, cold, patient, eternal. From the south came fire, wild, consuming, alive. And where they met, where the impossible marriage of opposites created the first spark of existence, there began the story of women who would be forged by the same elemental forces that shaped the gods themselves. Picture this, if you can. A world where every breath is visible in the air, where survival depends not on comfort, but on courage, not on shelter, but on strength. Here, in the fjords of Norway, the mountains of Iceland, the forests of Sweden, women learned to be unbreakable not because they chose to be, but because breaking meant death. What makes a woman unbreakable? Is it the ice in her veins or the fire in her heart? Is it the weight of responsibility she carries or the lightness with which she carries it? The Norse understood something we have forgotten in our heated houses and cushioned lives. They knew that strength is not the absence of fear, but the decision to continue despite it. They knew that love is not the absence of loss, but the willingness to love anyway. They knew that a woman's power comes not from being sheltered from the storm, but from learning to dance in the rain. In those ancient halls, where smoke curled up through holes in the roof towards stars that seemed close enough to touch, where the floor was packed earth and the walls were logs chinked with clay and moss, women moved with a purpose that was both practical and sacred. They were not ornaments to be admired or possessions to be protected. They were partners in the grand adventure of survival, co-creators in the daily miracle of turning raw materials into life itself. The fire crackled in the central hearth, casting dancing shadows on faces that had learned to read the weather in each other's eyes, to measure the seasons in each other's silences. These women knew that every day was a gift that might be the last, every meal a feast that might not come again, every embrace a treasure that time could steal without warning. Watch them now, through the lens of centuries, through the mist of memory and the fog of time. See how they move through their days with the fluid grace of those who have made peace with uncertainty. Their hands are never idle, spinning thread, weaving cloth, preparing food, tending children, healing wounds both seen and unseen. But their minds are always working, always planning, always preparing for the 100 different futures that tomorrow might bring. They are daughters of ice and fire, these Norse women. In their veins flows the patience of glaciers and the passion of volcanic springs. In their hearts burns the steady flame that no wind can extinguish, the flame that transforms a house into a home, a family into a fortress, a moment into a memory that will outlast the stones themselves. And in the long winter nights, when darkness lasted 20 hours and the aurora borealis painted the sky in colours that had no names, they would gather around the fire to tell stories. Stories of the gods who were as flawed and fierce as the people who worshipped them. Stories of heroes who were as vulnerable and brave as the women who loved them. Stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things simply because ordinary things were not enough. They were instruction manuals for living, roadmaps for navigating the treacherous terrain of human existence, mirrors in which each listener could see their own reflection and find their own strength. For in those stories, the women were not passive observers of their own lives. They were active participants, decision-makers, problem solvers, leaders, warriors, healers, seers, and sages. They were complex characters in their own right, not simple supporting cast members in someone else's adventure. The Norse sagas tell us of women who could see the future, who could heal with herbs and words, who could manage households and navigate politics, who could inspire men to greatness and call them to account for their failures. They tell us of women who chose their own paths, even when those paths led through darkness, even when those paths led away from safety and toward the unknown. As the fire burns lower and the shadows grow longer, as your breathing slows and your eyelids grow heavy, remember this: the ice and fire that created the world also created these women. And that same ice and fire flows through your veins too, waiting to be awakened, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting to transform you from someone who merely survives into someone who truly lives. The mist rises, the stars wheel overhead, and somewhere in the space between waking and sleeping, between knowing and wondering, the ancient voices whisper, "You are stronger than you know. You are braver than you believe. You are more beloved than you can imagine." And in the beginning there was ice and fire, and there still is. Deep in the winter darkness, when the sun has forgotten how to rise and the world exists in shades of blue and silver, there sits a woman by a fire that burns with flames of every color. She rocks gently, back and forth, and in her eyes you can see depths that have no bottom, wisdom that has no limits, knowledge that comes from places where ordinary people fear to go. She is Völva, the seeress, the wise woman, the keeper of secrets that the gods themselves whisper in the spaces between heartbeats. Her voice, when she speaks, carries the weight of all the words that have ever been spoken and all the words that have yet to be born. Listen. The soft rustle of her ceremonial robes, the gentle clink of the silver brooches that fasten her cloak, the almost silent whisper of breath that carries prayers to places beyond the reach of ordinary prayer. She is preparing for the journey that only she can take, the journey between the worlds of the living and the dead, between what is and what might be, between the questions that torment us and the answers that might save us or destroy us. In the smoky hall, shadows dance on wooden walls carved with runes that hurt to look at too closely, symbols that seem to shift and change when you're not watching directly, letters that spell out words in languages that were old when the world was young. The air is thick with the smoke of sacred herbs, juniper and mugwort, vervain and yarrow, plants that open doorways in the mind, that thin the veil between the seen and the unseen, that allow consciousness to slip its moorings and drift into stranger seas. The Völva closes her eyes, but she does not sleep. She sinks deeper into a trance that is more awake than waking, more aware than awareness itself. Her breathing slows, becomes rhythmic, becomes the heartbeat of the universe itself. And then she begins to speak. But the words that come from her lips are not her own. They belong to the dead who cannot rest, to the gods who cannot be silent, to the future that presses against the present, like water against a dam, seeking release, seeking expression, seeking someone brave enough to give it voice. What did they see, these women who traveled between worlds? What knowledge did they carry back from the realm of spirits and shadows? What truths were too terrible to speak aloud, too beautiful to keep hidden, too important to ignore? They saw the threads of fate, that connect every action to every consequence, every choice to every outcome, every moment to every other moment in an endless web of cause and effect. They saw how the smallest decision could ripple outward like stones thrown into still water, creating waves that would crash against shores that had not yet been born. They saw the gods themselves, not as distant, perfect beings, but as complex characters in a drama that had no script, no director, no predetermined ending. They saw Odin hanging from the world tree, sacrificing himself to himself in pursuit of wisdom that might save or damn them all. They saw Frigg weeping for her son Balder, her tears becoming the dewdrops that bless the morning grass. They saw the Norns at the base of Yggdrasil, weaving the fates of gods and mortals alike with threads of possibility and necessity. But more than that, they saw the truth that most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid, that everything ends. That every story has a final chapter, every song a final note, every life a final breath. They saw Ragnarök, the twilight of the gods, the end of everything that was and the beginning of everything that might be. And yet, in seeing this ending, they also saw the hope beyond it. They saw the green shoot that would grow from the ashes of the world tree, the new world that would rise from the ruins of the old, the children who would play in meadows where once gods had fought their final battles. The Völva's power was not just in seeing the future, but in understanding the present. She could look into a person's eyes and see the tangled threads of their past, the choices that had brought them to this moment, the fears and hopes that would shape their tomorrow. She could offer counsel not just about what would happen, but about what should happen, what could happen, what must happen if the cosmic balance was to be maintained. Kings and jarls would travel great distances to consult with her, bringing gifts of gold and silver, precious stones and rare furs. But she accepted these offerings not out of greed, but out of understanding that knowledge has a price, that wisdom cannot be given freely without losing its value, that the seeker must sacrifice something of themselves to be worthy of what they seek to receive. And in those moments of consultation, when the Völva spoke the words that would change lives and reshape destinies, she carried a burden that few could understand. For to see the future is to become responsible for it. To know what is coming is to become accountable for how that knowledge is used. Sometimes the visions were beautiful. She might see a young woman finding true love, a warrior achieving glory, a child growing up to become a great leader. But just as often, the visions were dark. She might see betrayal and loss, sickness and death, the failure of crops and the coming of war. Yet she spoke these truths anyway, because truth is truth regardless of whether we want to hear it, because knowledge is knowledge whether it brings joy or sorrow, because the future exists whether we acknowledge it or not. In the flickering firelight, the Völva's voice grows softer, more distant, as if she is speaking from the far side of a great chasm. Her words begin to fade, to blend with the crackling of the flames and the whisper of wind through the smoke hole in the roof. The spirits that spoke through her are returning to their own realm. The doorway between worlds is slowly closing. The trance is beginning to lift, but the knowledge remains. The truth that was spoken in the space between sleeping and waking continues to echo long after the words themselves have faded into silence. And as you drift toward your own sleep, your own dreams, your own journey into the realm of the unconscious, remember this: the Völva's greatest gift was not her ability to see what others could not see, but her courage to speak what others could not speak, to carry the burden of knowledge that others could not carry, to stand at the crossroads between worlds and serve as a bridge for those who needed to cross but could not find the way alone. What did they see in the spaces between heartbeats? Perhaps they saw you, listening to their story across the centuries, carrying their memory forward into a future they could only dream of, proving that some things, love, courage, wisdom, truth, are indeed eternal. The fire burns low, the shadows lengthen, and in the darkness, the Völva's voice whispers one final prophecy. Sleep now, and dream of the strength you do not yet know you possess. Listen to the soft symphony of morning in a Norse household, the gentle creak of wood settling in the cold, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the quiet rustle of wool blankets being folded with care, and threading through it all, like a melody that ties all other sounds together, the soft clink of keys at a woman's belt. Keys! Such small things, made of iron and worn smooth by countless touches. But in the world of the Norse, those keys were more than metal. They were symbols of power, emblems of authority, tokens of trust that could not be bought or stolen, only earned through years of wisdom and careful stewardship. The woman who wears them moves through her domain with the quiet confidence of a queen surveying her kingdom. But that is what she is, in truth, a queen whose realm may not span continents, but encompasses something far more precious, the daily miracle of transforming raw materials into the stuff of life itself. Watch her as she begins her day, moving through rooms that are both workplace and sanctuary, both fortress and home. Her feet know every board that creaks, every stone that shifts, every shadow that changes with the movement of the sun. This is her territory, mapped not by surveyors but by love, measured not in acres but in the countless acts of care that have shaped every corner, every surface, every object into an extension of her will. The first key opens the chest where the household's wealth is stored. Not just silver and gold, though there may be some of that, but the real treasures of survival. The carefully preserved foods that will carry the family through the lean months, the medicines that will fight off sickness and injury, the tools and materials that will enable creation and repair when the merchant ships are locked away by ice. She counts and measures with hands that have learned to judge by touch, eyes that can assess quality and quantity with a glance. This is not hoarding but stewardship, not greed but responsibility. She holds the survival of her household in her hands, makes decisions that will ripple through the months and seasons to come. Too generous now, and they may starve later. Too stingy now, and opportunities for trade and alliance may be lost forever. The second key opens the storeroom where the wool is kept, mountains of it, soft and rough, natural and dyed, raw and processed. Here is the foundation of comfort and commerce, both, for in a world where winter can kill and warmth is measured, not in degrees, but in the thickness of what lies between flesh and freezing air, the woman who controls the wool controls life itself. She runs her fingers through the fibers, feeling for quality, checking for pests, planning the work that will transform these raw materials into the clothing and blankets and tapestries that will shelter her family and serve as currency in the complex economy of medieval survival. Each strand represents hours of work, the shearing and cleaning, the combing and spinning, the weaving and dyeing that will turn sheep's fleece into the fabric of civilization. But there is more to her authority than mere material management. The third key opens the door to the weaving room, where the great loom stands like an altar to the domestic arts. Here, in the rhythm of shuttle and thread, in the patient building of pattern and texture, she exercises a power that is both practical and mystical. For the Norse believed that the very act of weaving was connected to the deepest mysteries of existence. The Norns themselves, those three sisters who controlled the fate of gods and mortals alike, were weavers who worked at a loom that spanned the cosmos, creating the patterns that determined who would live and who would die, who would prosper and who would suffer, who would be remembered and who would be forgotten. And so, as the housewife works at her loom, she participates in this cosmic weaving, creating not just cloth but meaning, not just warmth but wonder. Every thread she places is a choice made. Every pattern she creates is a statement about beauty and order, and the possibility of finding harmony in chaos. The fourth key opens the pantry, where the fruits of her knowledge and planning are displayed in neat rows and careful arrangements. Here are the preserved meats and dried fish, the fermented dairy products and stored grains, the pickled vegetables and precious spices that will transform mere survival into something approaching feast. She has learned the secrets that keep food fresh and safe, the techniques passed down from mother to daughter through generations of women who understood that the difference between life and death often came down to knowing when to salt and when to smoke, when to dry and when to ferment, when to store and when to consume. But perhaps the most important key of all is the one that opens the marriage chest, where the symbols of her authority are kept. The household accounts, written in her own hand, recording the complex web of debts and credits, trades and obligations that connect her family to the larger community. The contracts and agreements that she has negotiated, the deals she has struck, the alliances she has forged through the careful management of resources and relationships. For in Norse society, the housewife was not merely a consumer but a producer, not merely a spender but an earner, not merely a keeper but a creator of wealth. She sold surplus production in the markets, invested in trade ventures, lent money at interest, and built the economic foundation that allowed her husband to pursue his activities as warrior, farmer, or craftsman. And yet, with all this power came responsibility that could crush a weaker spirit. The burden of knowing that your decisions affected not just yourself, but everyone you loved, that your mistakes could mean hunger or cold or vulnerability to enemies, that your success or failure determined whether the family name would be spoken with pride or shame in the generations to come. True power often wears humble clothes, and the Norse housewife understood this better than anyone. She wielded authority without arrogance, commanded respect without demanding it, shaped destinies without claiming credit. Her crown was made of keys, and her throne was a three-legged stool by the fire. But her sovereignty was as real as any king's. Can duty be chosen? Can servitude be sovereignty? The Norse housewife answered these questions, not with words but with actions, not with theories, but with the daily practice of transforming constraint into freedom, obligation into opportunity, burden into blessing. As the day ends and the keys are hung on their hook by the door, as the fire burns low and the household settles into sleep, remember this: power is not always loud, strength is not always visible, and the most important kingdoms are often the ones that exist within the walls of home, in the hearts of families, in the hands of women who understand that the greatest victories are often the quietest ones. The keys rest silent now, but tomorrow they will sing again their soft song of authority, their gentle music of power wielded with wisdom, their quiet anthem of sovereignty worn like a crown that only those with eyes to see can recognize for what it truly is. The mist rises from the battlefield like the breath of sleeping giants, and through it, shadows move with purpose and deadly grace. The ring of steel on steel echoes across the morning air, punctuated by battle cries that seemed to come from the throats of wolves rather than human beings. And there, standing shoulder to shoulder with bearded warriors, their hair braided with silver rings and their eyes bright with the fire of battle, are women. Not the delicate flowers of courtly romance, not the helpless maidens of later tales, but daughters of the North who have chosen the sword over the spindle, the shield over the hearth, honor over safety. They are the shield maidens of legend and the warrior women of reality, and their stories blur the line between history and myth until it becomes impossible to say where one ends and the other begins. Listen to the whisper of wind through abandoned battlefields, and you might hear their voices still, calling to their comrades, crying out their lineage and their loyalty, challenging their enemies to test their courage against the steel of their resolve. These are the women who proved that courage knows no gender, that honor transcends flesh, that the warrior's code burns just as brightly in a woman's heart as in a man's. But who were they really, these daughters of the shield wall? Were they the Amazon warriors of Hollywood imagination, or something more complex, more nuanced, more real than fiction could ever capture? The archaeological evidence speaks in whispers and fragments. Here, a woman's grave containing weapons and warrior's gear. There, a skeleton showing the scars of battle wounds and the muscle development of someone trained to fight. Bones that tell stories of women who lived lives of physical challenge and violent possibility, who died deaths that were anything but peaceful. The sagas speak more loudly, but their voices are coloured by the imagination of storytellers who understood that the best stories contain more truth than mere facts could ever provide. They tell us of Lagertha, who fought beside Ragnar Lothbrok and proved herself the equal of any man in battle. They speak of Brynhild, the warrior maiden who would only marry the man brave enough to ride through a ring of fire to reach her. They remember the daughters of kings who chose to lead their own war bands, rather than be traded away in marriage to secure their father's alliances. But perhaps the most important truth about these warrior women is not whether they existed exactly as the stories describe them, but what their existence meant to the people who told those stories, who preserved those memories, who passed down those examples from generation to generation. In a world where survival often depended on the ability to fight, where raids and feuds were as common as thunderstorms, where the difference between life and death could come down to how quickly you could draw your sword, the idea of the defenseless woman was not romantic, but suicidal. Norse women learned to fight because they had to, because the alternative was to be helpless victims when their men were away, because strength was not a luxury, but a necessity. Watch them training in the morning light, their movements flowing like water, like wind, like the dance of predators who have learned that grace and deadliness are not opposites, but partners. They practice with spear and sword, with axe and shield, learning the brutal calculus of combat, where hesitation means death and mercy is a luxury that only the victor can afford. But they also train their minds, studying the art of war as deeply as any general, understanding that the greatest victories are won not through strength alone, but through intelligence, strategy, the ability to read an enemy's intentions and respond before those intentions become actions. They learn to fight not just with their bodies, but with their wits, not just with weapons, but with words, not just as individuals, but as part of a larger whole that is stronger than the sum of its parts. The shield wall itself becomes a metaphor for everything they believe in, the idea that individuals, no matter how strong, are vulnerable when they stand alone, but become nearly invincible when they stand together. Each warrior's shield protects not just themselves, but their neighbors, creating a barrier that can withstand charges that would crush any single fighter. And in this wall of shields and spears, of determination and discipline, the women take their place, not as exceptions to be marveled at, but as warriors whose courage has been tested and proven, whose loyalty has been earned through shared danger, whose strength has been forged in the same fire that tempers the steel of their weapons. Yet even as they embrace the warrior's path, they carry with them the other aspects of their womanhood. They are daughters who remember their mother's lullabies even as they sing their own war songs. They are potential mothers themselves, who understand that the children they might bear will inherit the world that their battles help to shape. They are sisters and lovers and friends who fight not for the love of violence, but for the love of those who depend on their strength. The complexity of their position becomes clear when we consider the archaeology of their graves. Alongside the weapons and armor, we find jewelry and domestic tools, cosmetics and cooking implements, the artifacts of lives that encompassed both war and peace, both destruction and creation, both the masculine and feminine aspects of human experience. These women did not reject their femininity to embrace their warrior nature. They expanded their definition of what femininity could include. They proved that a woman could be both fierce and gentle, both protective and nurturing, both deadly and life-giving, depending on what the situation required. And when the battle was over, when the dead were counted and the wounded tended, when the victory songs were sung and the defeat mourned, they returned to their other roles as daughters and wives. As mothers and leaders, as the keepers of households and the weavers of community bonds, the sword went back to its sheath, but the strength that had wielded it remained, transformed but not diminished, redirected but not reduced. Perhaps it doesn't matter if the spirit remains true. Perhaps the most important truth about the Shield Maidens is not whether they fought in exactly the battles the sagas describe, but whether they represent something real and vital about the human spirit. The refusal to accept limitations based on gender, the determination to be defined by character rather than biology. As the mist clears from the ancient battlefields, as the echoes of war cries fade into the whisper of wind through grass, remember this: the daughters of the Shield Wall fought not because they loved violence, but because they loved something more than they feared death. They stood in the battle line not because they rejected their womanhood, but because they refused to let their womanhood be defined by weakness. And in their courage, in their strength, in their willingness to stand and fight when standing, and fighting was what the moment required, they showed that honor truly knows no gender, that courage truly transcends flesh, that the warrior's spirit burns equally bright in every heart brave enough to kindle it. The battle is over, but the example remains. The Shield Maidens have passed into legend, but their legacy lives on in every woman who refuses to be limited by others' expectations, who chooses her own path regardless of tradition, who stands her ground when standing is required, and knows that true strength comes not from the sword in her hand, but from the courage in her heart. In the flickering light of torches that cast dancing shadows on the walls of the Great Hall, two families sit across from each other, like diplomats negotiating the terms of a treaty. And in many ways, that is exactly what they are doing. For in the world of the Norse, marriage was not merely the union of two hearts, but the joining of two bloodlines, two households, two economic and political entities whose alliance could mean the difference between prosperity and poverty, between safety and vulnerability, between honor and shame. The air is thick with the smoke of the central fire and the tension of careful calculation. Words are weighed like precious metals, promises measured like grain, every gesture analyzed for its meaning and implications. This is the marriage negotiation, where love and law dance their eternal partnership, where duty and desire must find some way to coexist, where the freedom to choose must balance against the necessity to survive. But listen, beneath the formal language of bride price and dowry, beneath the careful diplomacy of alliance and agreement, something else stirs. The soft rustle of silk and wool as bodies shift nervously in their seats. The quiet intake of breath as eyes meet across the space between families. The flutter of hearts that have not yet learned whether they will be allowed to follow their own rhythm or must beat in time to the drumbeat of duty. The bride-to-be sits among her kinswomen, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes downcast in proper modesty. But those who know how to look can see the intelligence that flickers behind her lowered lashes, the assessment going on behind her careful composure. She is not merely a passive object being negotiated over, but an active participant in her own fate, listening to every word, weighing every proposal, understanding that her voice, when she chooses to use it, will carry weight in this decision that will shape the rest of her life. But Norse women, unlike their sisters in many other medieval societies, possessed rights that would seem revolutionary even by modern standards. They could refuse a marriage proposal, even one backed by their families. They could own property in their own names and keep it separate from their husband's holdings. They could initiate divorce proceedings and retain custody of their children. They could testify in legal proceedings and make contracts in their own right. These freedoms, however, existed within a web of family honor, political necessity, and economic reality that could make choice feel more like illusion than liberty. A woman might have the legal right to refuse a marriage, but could she afford to do so if that marriage would protect her family from their enemies? She might be able to own property, but what good was ownership if she lacked the physical strength to defend what was hers? She might be able to seek divorce, but where would she go and how would she survive if her family disowned her for bringing shame upon their name? And so, as the negotiations continue through the long evening, as the terms are discussed and debated, modified and refined, the bride-to-be must navigate between what she wants and what she needs, between her personal desires and her family obligations, between the life she might have imagined for herself and the life that circumstances are offering her. The groom, too, faces his own complex mixture of choice and constraint. Perhaps he has been struck by the beauty of the woman who sits across from him. Perhaps her reputation for wisdom and skill has reached his ears. Perhaps he hopes that affection might grow between them in time. But he also knows that this marriage will determine not just his personal happiness, but his family's future prosperity, his children's inheritance, his own standing in the community. Their eyes meet for a moment across the space between the two families, and in that brief contact, whole conversations take place without words. Questions asked and answered, hopes shared and fears acknowledged, possibilities explored and limitations accepted. They are two people trying to read each other's souls through a single glance, trying to guess whether the stranger sitting across from them will become a partner or merely a burden, a source of joy or merely a duty to be endured. The older women in both families watch this exchange with eyes that have seen many such meetings, many such marriages, many such attempts to balance the heart's desires with the world's demands. They remember their own wedding negotiations, their own moments of uncertainty and hope, their own struggles to find love within the boundaries of law and custom. Some of them married for love and found it a foundation strong enough to support a lifetime of partnership. Others married for duty and discovered that respect and affection could grow even where passion had never bloomed. Still others found their marriages to be sources of loneliness and disappointment, relationships that provided security but not satisfaction, alliance but not affection. But all of them understood something that their younger selves had yet to learn, that marriage, like any other human institution, is what the people within it choose to make it. The law might define the terms and conditions, society might set the expectations and boundaries, but the daily reality of sharing a life with another person depends on countless small choices, countless moments of kindness or cruelty, countless decisions to build up or tear down, to give or to withhold, to love or merely to coexist. As the evening grows later and the final terms are agreed upon, as the bride price is settled and the dowry arranged, as the date is set and the witnesses chosen, the couple at the center of all this negotiation must begin to imagine their life together. Will they share a partnership of equals, or will one dominate the other? Will they find ways to honor both their individual natures and their joint destiny? Will they create a household that is a sanctuary for both of them, or merely a stage where they perform their assigned roles? The marriage feast, when it comes, will be a celebration of hope as much as of alliance. The guests will drink toasts to the couple's future prosperity and happiness, will share stories of other successful marriages, will offer advice and blessings and prayers for fertility and long life. But beneath the joy and celebration will run an undercurrent of awareness that this is also a kind of gamble, a bet placed on the future, an investment in the possibility that two people can become more together than they ever were apart. And in the quiet moments between the public ceremonies, in the private conversations that happen away from the ears of relatives and witnesses, the bride and groom will begin the real work of marriage, learning to see each other as individuals rather than symbols, discovering what they actually like and dislike about each other, figuring out how to navigate the space between intimacy and independence, between devotion and autonomy. Love, they will learn, is not a feeling that strikes like lightning and burns forever unchanged. It is a choice that must be made again and again, day after day, year after year. It is a skill that must be practiced and refined, a garden that must be tended and nurtured, a fire that must be fed if it is not to die down to cold ashes. Is chosen duty different from imposed fate? Can freedom exist within the boundaries of obligation? Can two people truly become one while remaining themselves? These are the questions that every marriage must answer, and the answers are never simple, never final, never the same for any two couples. As the torches burn low and the negotiations draw to a close, as the families begin to make their farewells and the couple prepares to begin their new life together, remember this: the greatest marriages are not those that are free from constraint, but those that transform constraint into choice, that find freedom within commitment, that discover that the deepest love is not the absence of duty, but the joy of choosing duty again and again, because the person who benefits from that choice is someone worth choosing. The marriage compact is signed, but the real marriage is just beginning. In the deep blue hour before dawn, when the world exists in that sacred space between night and day, between sleeping and waking, between the dreams that fade and the reality that beckons. A woman sits by the dying embers of the fire, her child at her breast, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond the door for dangers that may never come, but must always be anticipated. Listen to the soft sounds of this moment, the gentle sucking of the infant at her breast, the quiet whisper of her own breathing, the almost inaudible murmur of the lullaby that falls from her lips like a blessing, like a prayer, like a promise that she will do everything in her power to keep this small life safe in a world that seems designed to destroy whatever is tender and vulnerable and innocent. This is motherhood in the Norse world, not the sentimentalized version of later ages, where mothers are portrayed as fragile creatures who must be protected from life's harsh realities, but the fierce, practical, utterly realistic version of women who understood that bringing a child into the world is both an act of ultimate hope and ultimate responsibility. She knows, this nursing mother, that the child in her arms may grow up to be a warrior who dies young on some distant battlefield. She knows that disease or accident or the simple cruelty of fate may steal this precious life before it has a chance to fully bloom. She knows that the world is full of wolves, both literal and metaphorical, and that her love alone will not be enough to keep them at bay. And yet she pours that love into this small body anyway, feeds it with her own substance, warms it with her own heat, surrounds it with her own protection. Because this is what mothers do. They choose hope over fear, life over death, love over the certainty of loss. Watch her as she moves through her days. This Norse mother, balancing the baby on her hip while she kneads bread, teaching her older children their letters while she spins wool, listening to their recitation of family genealogies while she prepares the evening meal. She is constantly multitasking, constantly aware of where each child is and what they are doing, constantly calculating risks and making decisions that will affect their safety, their education, their future prospects. But she is also consciously preparing them for a world that will not coddle them, that will not make allowances for weakness, that will demand from them the same strength and courage and resilience that it has demanded from every generation that came before them. Her love is not soft but strong, not protective but preparatory, not sheltering but empowering. She teaches her daughters to spin and weave, to cook and clean, to manage households and handle money. But she also teaches them to think for themselves, to speak up when they have something to say, to stand their ground when they believe they are right. She shows them that being a woman does not mean being weak, that femininity and strength are not opposites, but partners, that the traditional roles of wife and mother are positions of power and responsibility, not powerlessness and dependence. She teaches her sons to fight and hunt, to work with their hands, to honor their word and protect their family. But she also teaches them to respect women, to understand that courage comes in many forms, to value wisdom as much as strength. She shows them that being a man does not mean being cruel, that masculinity and gentleness are not enemies but allies, that the greatest warriors are often those who know when not to fight. And to all her children, regardless of gender, she teaches the most important lesson of all, that they are part of something larger than themselves, connected to a family line that stretches back into the misty origins of time and forward into a future that they will help to shape. She tells them the stories of their ancestors, recites the genealogies that connect them to heroes and kings, explains the family honor that they carry and must pass on to their own children someday. But perhaps the most difficult aspect of Norse motherhood is the knowledge that this fierce love, this protective instinct, this desire to keep her children safe and happy must be balanced against the need to prepare them for independence, for the day when they will have to make their own way in the world without her guidance or protection. She must teach them to be brave enough to face whatever comes, but not so reckless that they seek out unnecessary danger. She must teach them to be trusting enough to form relationships and alliances, but not so naive that they cannot recognize when they are being deceived or manipulated. She must teach them to be generous enough to help others, but not so giving that they allow themselves to be exploited. The paradox of motherhood is that its ultimate goal is its own obsolescence, to raise children who no longer need a mother, to love so well that love becomes unnecessary, to protect so thoroughly that protection becomes irrelevant. And for Norse mothers, this paradox was complicated by the additional knowledge that their children might be called upon to face challenges that no mother could prepare them for, to make choices that no mother could make for them, to endure losses that no mother could prevent. In the long winter nights, when the aurora borealis painted the sky in colours that had no names, the Norse mother would sit by the fire with her children gathered around her, telling them the stories that would shape their understanding of themselves and their world. Stories of gods who were flawed and human, of heroes who succeeded through persistence rather than perfection, of ordinary people who found extraordinary strength when circumstances demanded it. These stories were not entertainment but instruction, not escapism but preparation. They taught children how to think about courage and honor, about loyalty and betrayal, about the complex relationships between individual desires and communal responsibilities. They provided models for behavior, examples of what to strive for and what to avoid, illustrations of how to navigate the complicated terrain of human relationships and moral choices. But even as she told these stories, even as she tried to prepare her children for every possible future, the Norse mother knew that the most important thing she could give them was not specific knowledge or particular skills, but rather the confidence that they could handle whatever came their way, the resilience to bounce back from setbacks and failures, the wisdom to learn from their mistakes without being crushed by them. And so she loved them with a love that was both tender and tough, both nurturing and challenging, both supportive and demanding. She held them close when they needed comfort, but she also pushed them to grow when they needed to be pushed. She celebrated their successes without letting them become arrogant, and she helped them process their failures without letting them become defeated. Motherhood, she understood, was not about creating perfect children, but about creating strong ones, not about preventing all pain, but about teaching resilience. Not about solving all problems, but about developing problem-solving skills. It was about giving children roots deep enough to anchor them in storms and wings, strong enough to carry them toward their own destinies. As the child at her breast finally falls asleep, as the fire burns down to glowing coals, as the first light of dawn begins to creep through the cracks in the shutters, the Norse mother allows herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Another day has passed, another small victory in the ongoing campaign to raise human beings who will be worthy of the family name, who will contribute to the community's well-being, who will face their own challenges with courage and wisdom and grace. How do you teach strength without hardening hearts? How do you prepare for loss while maintaining love? The Norse mother answered these questions, not with words, but with the daily practice of loving fiercely while holding lightly, of investing completely while accepting uncertainty, of hoping for the best while preparing for the worst. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new opportunities to teach and learn, new chances to love and be loved. But tonight, in this quiet moment between today and tomorrow, between the child's needs and the world's demands, between the mother's hopes and the future's uncertainties, there is peace. The mother's milk flows, the battle scars fade, and love continues its eternal work of transforming ordinary moments into sacred ones, ordinary people into extraordinary ones, ordinary families into the foundations upon which entire civilizations are built. The autumn mist clings to the ancient stones like the tears of those who have grieved too long, and through it walks a figure draped in the dark wool of mourning. Her footsteps are soft but certain, her bearing straight, despite the weight of sorrow that sits upon her shoulders like a cloak she cannot remove. She is the widow, the woman who has learned that love and loss are not opposites but partners in the dance of human existence. Behind her, the freshly turned earth of the burial mound speaks of endings and beginnings, of a life completed and a new life that must somehow be constructed from the fragments of the old. The wind carries the scent of dying leaves and the promise of winter, reminding her that the seasons turn regardless of human grief, that the world continues its eternal cycle of death and rebirth, whether we are ready or not. She pauses at the graveside, her hand resting on the stone that marks her husband's final resting place. The runes carved into its surface tell his story, his lineage and accomplishments, his victories and virtues, the legacy he leaves behind. But they cannot tell the private story, the intimate history that she alone knows, the thousand small moments that made up the fabric of their shared life. The morning he brought her wildflowers just because the sight of them made him think of her smile. The night he held her through fever, bathing her forehead with cool water and whispering prayers to gods he barely believed in. The day their first child was born, and she saw tears in his eyes that he tried to hide behind gruff jokes and practical concerns. The evening he taught their daughter to carve runes, his large hands guiding her small ones with infinite patience. These memories are hers alone now, treasures that cannot be shared, burdens that no one else can help her carry. And yet, even as she grieves for what is lost, she must somehow find the strength to embrace what remains, the children who still need her guidance, the household that still requires her management, the future that still demands her participation. Norse law protected widows in ways that were revolutionary for their time. She could inherit her husband's property, manage his business affairs, make legal decisions on behalf of her children. She could choose to remarry or remain single, could move back to her family's home or establish her own independent household. The law gave her options, but it could not make those options easy. For with freedom comes responsibility, and with choices come consequences. If she remarries, she gains the protection and support of a new husband, but she also risks losing some of her independence and authority. If she remains single, she maintains her autonomy, but must face the challenges of managing property and defending her interests without a male partner in a world that often assumes women need male guidance. And then there are the children to consider. Young ones who need care and protection, older ones who need guidance and education, all of them trying to make sense of a world that has suddenly become less secure, less predictable, less safe. She must be both mother and father to them now, providing not just emotional comfort but practical direction, not just love but leadership. Watch her as she moves through the daily routines that must continue despite everything that has changed. The animals still need to be fed, the harvest still needs to be gathered, the winter preparations still need to be made. But now she must make all the decisions that her husband once made, must solve all the problems that he once solved, must bear all the responsibilities that they once shared. She stands in the doorway of the storehouse, calculating how much grain they will need to last through the winter, how much can be sold or traded, How much should be saved for seed in the spring? These are not just practical calculations, but matters of survival, decisions that will determine whether her family prospers or merely endures, whether they maintain their social standing or slip into dependence on others' charity. The other women in the community watch her with a mixture of sympathy and assessment. Some offer help and support, understanding that today's widow could be tomorrow's anyone. Others wait to see whether she will prove strong enough to manage on her own, or will need to be absorbed into their households, their protection, their sphere of influence. And the men are complicated. Some offer assistance out of genuine concern for her welfare and that of her children. Others see opportunity in her vulnerability, calculating whether her property and her need for protection might be turned to their advantage. Still others simply don't know how to relate to a woman who suddenly occupies a position that challenges their assumptions about gender and authority. But perhaps the most difficult challenge she faces is not external, but internal. The need to discover who she is when she is no longer half of a couple, when she is no longer defined primarily by her relationship to her husband. For years, her identity has been shaped by partnership, by the constant give and take of shared decision-making, by the comfort of knowing that someone else shared both the burdens and the satisfactions of adult life. Now she must learn to be complete in herself, to find strength in solitude, to make peace with a loneliness that no amount of activity or company can completely fill. She must discover what parts of herself were always there, waiting to be developed, and what parts were so intertwined with her marriage that they have died along with her husband. In the long evenings, when the children are asleep and the household is quiet, she sits by the fire with her thoughts and memories, her hopes and fears, her plans and regrets. Sometimes she speaks aloud to her husband's spirit, asking his advice about decisions she must make, sharing news about the children's progress, telling him about the small victories and defeats of her days. Whether he hears her or not, these conversations help her process her experiences, maintain her connection to the past while building her capacity for the future. And gradually, slowly, painfully, she begins to discover that grief and growth are not mutually exclusive, that it is possible to honor what was lost while building what is new, that the strength she develops in widowhood is not a betrayal of her marriage, but a tribute to it. Her husband's love, she realizes, was not meant to make her dependent, but to help her become strong enough to survive his absence. The other widows in the community become her teachers and her allies, sharing the hard-won wisdom of women who have walked this path before her. They teach her practical skills, how to negotiate with merchants, how to manage servants, how to navigate the legal system, but more importantly, they teach her emotional skills, how to carry grief without being crushed by it, how to find joy in small things when large happiness seems impossible, how to build a new life that honors the old one without being imprisoned by it. Some of these women have remarried and found new happiness. Others have remained single and discovered unexpected freedom. Still others have created hybrid arrangements, partnerships that provide companionship and support without the full legal and emotional commitments of marriage. Each has found her own way of balancing security and independence, tradition and innovation, the needs of the community and the demands of the heart. Does strength chosen in desperation count as strength at all? The widow learns that it does, that the courage born of necessity is still courage, that the wisdom earned through suffering is still wisdom, that the love that survives loss is perhaps the truest love of all. As winter approaches and the days grow shorter, as the mist thickens and the stones grow cold, The widow pulls her cloak more tightly around her shoulders and turns away from the grave. The dead are at peace, but the living have work to do. Behind her, the wind whispers through the ancient stones, carrying the voices of all the women who have walked this path before her, all the women who will walk it after her, all the women who understand that loss is not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new chapter. She is no longer a wife, but she is still a woman. She is no longer protected, but she is still strong. She is no longer complete in the way she once was, but she is learning to be whole in a new way, a way that honors both her past and her future, both her grief and her hope, both her mortality and her enduring spirit. The widow's burden is also the widow's gift, the knowledge that love survives death, that strength can emerge from sorrow, that life continues even when we think we cannot go on. In carrying this burden with dignity, in transforming it into a source of wisdom and compassion, she becomes not just a survivor, but a teacher, not just a victim of circumstance, but a master of fate, by the hearth where countless fires have burned, where generations of children have gathered to listen and learn, where the smoke has carried prayers and stories up through the roof hole towards stars that have watched over this family since time began, sits a woman whose face is a map of all the years she has lived, all the joys and sorrows she has witnessed, all the wisdom she has gathered like flowers in the garden of her long life. Her hands, gnarled now with age but still steady, still sure, move in ancient patterns as she works, knitting perhaps, or spinning, or simply folding and refolding the same piece of cloth that has been worn soft by countless similar gestures. But her real work is not in her hands, but in her voice, in the stories that flow from her lips like water from a sacred spring, carrying the accumulated wisdom of generations down to the eager ears of those who will carry it forward into the future. Listen to the children gathered at her feet, their eyes wide with wonder and attention, their young minds drinking in every word like dry earth drinks the first rain of spring. They do not yet understand that they are witnesses to something precious, something irreplaceable, something that will disappear forever when this old woman draws her last breath and closes her eyes for the final time. For in a world without books, without written records, without libraries or schools as we know them, the grandmother is the keeper of everything that matters. She holds in her memory the genealogies that connect each child to their ancestors, the stories that explain why the family follows certain customs and avoids certain actions, the practical knowledge that has been tested and refined by generations of women who learned through trial and error what works and what doesn't. She knows which herbs heal, which ailments, which signs predict changes in the weather, which rituals must be performed at which times of year, to ensure the family's continued prosperity and protection. She knows the names and characteristics of every ancestor back 7 generations, the history of every feud and alliance that has shaped the family's current position, the details of every marriage negotiation and property transfer that has brought the family to its present circumstances. But more than facts and figures, more than dates and names, she carries the stories that give meaning to all the dry information. She knows not just that great-grandfather Thorvald died in battle, but how he faced his death with courage and honor, what his last words were, how his widow managed to hold the family together in the aftermath of his loss. She knows not just that great-aunt Astrid was known for her skill at weaving, but how she used that skill to create tapestries that told the family's history, how she taught her craft to girls from neighboring families, how she turned domestic work into art and art into legacy. These stories are not just entertainment, though they entertain. They are not just history, though they preserve the past. They're instruction manuals for living, guidebooks for navigating the complex terrain of human relationships and moral choices. They teach by example rather than lecture, show rather than tell, inspire rather than command. Watch the children's faces as she tells them about the ancestor who gave up his own portion of food to feed a stranger's hungry child, and see how they absorb the lesson about generosity and compassion. Listen to their sharp intake of breath when she describes the ancestor who broke her word and brought shame upon the family, and see how they learn about the importance of keeping promises and maintaining honor. The grandmother does not moralize or preach. She simply tells the stories and trusts that the children will understand what they need to understand, will take from each tale what they are ready to receive, will return to the stories again and again throughout their lives, and find new meanings as their own experience deepens and expands. But she is not just a passive repository of information. She is an active teacher who knows how to shape and present her knowledge to maximum effect. She knows which stories to tell to which children, which lessons are needed at which moments, which examples will resonate most strongly with each individual personality and temperament. To the child who tends towards selfishness, she tells stories of ancestors who found happiness through service to others, who won their greatest victories through patience and strategic thinking. To the child who lacks confidence, she tells stories of ancestors who overcame great obstacles through persistence and courage. And always, woven through every story, is the thread that connects the past to the present to the future. The understanding that each child is not just an individual, but a link in a chain that stretches back into the mists of time and forward into possibilities not yet imagined. Each child carries the hopes and dreams of all who came before, and each child will pass those hopes and dreams, transformed by their own experience, to those who come after. The grandmother teaches them to see themselves as part of something larger and more enduring than their own brief lives. She helps them understand that their actions matter not just for themselves, but for the family honor, the community welfare, the continuing story of their people. She shows them that they are both inheritors and creators, both students and teachers, both individuals and representatives of something greater than themselves. But perhaps her most important gift to the children is not the specific knowledge she imparts, but the example she provides. The demonstration that aging does not mean becoming useless, that experience is a treasure to be shared rather than a burden to be endured, that wisdom grows more valuable, not less, as the years pass. In her presence, the children learn to see old age not as something to be feared or pitied, but as something to be respected and honored. They see that the grandmother's physical limitations have not diminished her mental acuity, that her dependency on others for some tasks has not made her less valuable as a person, that her proximity to death has not made her less alive. And in the long winter evenings, when the darkness presses close and the wind howls around the house like the voices of restless spirits, when the fire burns low and shadows dance on the walls, the grandmother's voice becomes a bridge between the world of the living and the world of the dead, between the realm of daily concerns and the realm of eternal truths. She speaks of ancestors who visit in dreams, offering guidance and comfort to their descendants. She tells of signs and portents that connect the family to the larger patterns of fate and destiny. She shares the traditional prayers and rituals that have been passed down through generations, the formulas for appealing to the gods and spirits for protection and blessing. What survives when flesh fails? What dies when the last storyteller falls silent? The grandmother knows that these questions are not abstract philosophical puzzles, but urgent practical concerns. She is racing against time, trying to pass on everything she knows before her own memory fails, her own voice stills, her own connection to the ancestral wisdom is severed. And so she tells the stories again and again, each time slightly different, each time emphasizing different aspects, each time responding to the particular needs and interests of her current audience. She knows that repetition is the key to retention, that the stories must be told many times before they become truly embedded in the listener's minds and hearts. But she also knows that she cannot control how the stories will be remembered after she is gone, how they will be interpreted and retold by those who come after her. Each generation will understand the old stories in new ways, will find new meanings and applications, will add their own experiences and insights to the accumulated wisdom of the ages. Memory is immortality, but it is also transformation. Stories are the only victory over time, but they are also time's willing collaborators, changing and growing and evolving as they pass from one generation to the next. The grandmother accepts this paradox, understands that the price of immortality is change, that the only way to preserve the past is to allow it to adapt to the present. As the fire burns lower and the children's eyelids grow heavy, as the stories wind down and the time for sleep approaches, the grandmother offers one final gift: the understanding that they too will someday be the keepers of memory, the tellers of tales, the bridges between past and future. The wisdom passes like torches in darkness, each generation responsible for keeping the flame alive, each storyteller adding their own light to the illumination that guides the family through the long night of history toward whatever dawn awaits beyond the horizon of the present moment. Salt spray kisses the weathered planks of the harbour as dawn breaks over water that stretches beyond the horizon, carrying with it the dreams of those who yearn for distant shores. The morning mist rises from the sea like the breath of sleeping giants, and through it ships appear and disappear like visions from another world, their sails full of wind and possibility, their hulls heavy with goods from lands whose names sound like poetry when spoken aloud. Standing at the edge of the wharf, her cloak whipping in the sea breeze, her hair braided with silver rings that catch the early light, is a woman whose eyes hold the same restless spirit as the waves themselves. She is counting, calculating, her fingers moving over beads on an abacus as she tallies the value of cargo that has traveled further than most people will ever journey, goods that carry with them the exotic scents and stories of distant marketplaces. She is the trader's daughter, born to a life where the horizon is not a boundary but an invitation, where foreign coins jingle in purses alongside familiar currency, where the dinner table conversation includes tales of strange customs and stranger peoples, where maps are not just pictures but promises of adventures yet to be undertaken. But listen closely to the sound of those coins in her leather pouch, silver from the Islamic world, inscribed with flowing Arabic script, Byzantine gold bearing the images of emperors whose names she cannot pronounce, hack silver from Ireland, marked with Celtic knots that speak of artistic traditions entirely different from her own. Each piece tells a story of trade routes that span continents, of relationships that bridge cultures, of economic networks that connect the Norse world to places as distant as Constantinople and as exotic as the Silk Road. Archaeological evidence has revealed the remarkable extent of Norse trading networks, and within that evidence, we find traces of women who participated actively in commercial life. Scales for weighing precious metals found in women's graves. Exotic jewelry and cosmetics that could only have been acquired through long-distance trade. Silver arm rings and neck rings that served as both ornament and currency. The material remains of lives lived in the space between cultures, in the intersection of different worlds. Watch her as she examines a bolt of silk that has traveled from China through the bazaars of Samarkand and the markets of Kiev to reach this northern port. Her fingers test the quality of the weave, assess the richness of the dyes, calculate the profit margin that will justify the risks of bringing such luxury goods to a land where most people dress in wool and linen. She understands that she is not just buying and selling commodities, but trading in dreams, in the human desire for beauty and novelty, and connection to the wider world. Yet her participation in this global economy is complicated by the realities of her gender and her culture. She cannot simply pack her belongings and set sail for distant lands, as her male relatives might do. Her responsibilities to family and household, her role as daughter and potential wife and mother, create anchor points that hold her to the familiar shores, even as her spirit yearns to explore the unknown waters beyond the horizon. But restriction breeds creativity, and the trader's daughter finds ways to travel without leaving home, to explore without abandoning her duties, to participate in the great adventure of international commerce while maintaining her connections to family and community. She becomes expert at evaluating goods brought by others, at negotiating prices and terms, at managing the complex logistics of long-distance trade from her base in the home port. She learns to read people as well as she reads market conditions, to assess the reliability of trading partners she may never meet again, to navigate the cultural differences that can turn a promising deal into a costly disaster. She develops networks of correspondents and agents, women and men who serve as her eyes and ears in distant markets, who alert her to opportunities and warn her of dangers, who help her maintain her position in trading relationships that span continents. The morning brings a ship returned from the eastern routes, its crew weathered by months at sea, its holds full of goods that will transform the local market and enrich those wise enough to have invested in the voyage. She greets the captain, not with the deference that many women would show to a man in his position, but with the professional respect of one trader acknowledging another. They speak the language of commerce, quantities and qualities, prices and profits, risks and rewards. But beneath the business discussion runs another conversation, one conducted in glances and gestures, in the spaces between words. He tells her of the markets in Novgorod, where furs from the northern forests are traded for silver from the south. He describes the cosmopolitan atmosphere of Constantinople, where merchants from a dozen different cultures compete for the favor of Byzantine customers whose wealth seems limitless. He shares stories of the river routes that carry Norse traders deep into the heart of Russia, following waterways that connect the Baltic to the Black Sea, the cold north to the warm south. Can you explore the world without leaving your responsibilities behind? The trader's daughter answers this question by refusing to accept it as an either-or proposition. She finds ways to have both adventure and stability, both exploration and rootedness, both the excitement of the unknown and the comfort of the familiar. She becomes a collector of stories as well as goods, gathering tales from returning travelers, preserving accounts of strange customs and foreign lands, building a mental map of the world that extends far beyond the physical boundaries of her own experience. She learns to speak fragments of foreign languages, to understand the basics of foreign customs, to appreciate the artistic traditions of cultures she has never directly encountered. And in turn, she becomes a bridge between worlds, helping her own community understand and appreciate the goods and ideas that flow in from distant places, translating not just languages, but entire ways of thinking and being. She helps her neighbors see that the world is larger and more diverse than they might have imagined, that their own customs and beliefs are not the only valid ways of organizing human life, that there is value in diversity and beauty in difference. The children of the community gather around her when she has news from the trading fleet, eager to hear about the marvels and mysteries of foreign lands. She tells them of cities built on water, where people travel by boat through streets that would elsewhere be filled with horses and carts. She describes markets where spices from India mingle with silks from China, where ivory from Africa is carved by craftsmen whose techniques have been passed down through generations, where the very air seems to shimmer with possibility and promise. But she also shares the more complex truths of international trade, the risks and disappointments, the cultural misunderstandings that can turn friends into enemies, the economic realities that make some dreams impossible to fulfill. She teaches them that the world beyond their borders is neither paradise nor hell, but simply another place where human beings struggle to build meaningful lives, to find happiness and security, to create beauty and purpose in the face of uncertainty and change. Some hearts are too large for any single shore, and the trader's daughter understands this truth in her bones. She knows that her spirit will always be drawn to the horizon. That part of her will always wonder what lies beyond the next headland, the next island, the next bend in the river. But she also knows that home is not a limitation, but a foundation, not a prison, but a sanctuary, not a denial of adventure, but a place where adventure can be processed and understood and appreciated. As the day progresses and the business of the port continues around her, as goods are loaded and unloaded, as prices are negotiated and deals are struck, as the complex machinery of international commerce grinds on in its ancient rhythms, the trader's daughter finds herself caught between gratitude and longing, between satisfaction and restlessness, between the life she has and the life she might have had. The ships will sail again, carrying with them the dreams of those brave enough to risk everything for the chance of discovering something new. The horizons will continue to beckon, promising adventures and opportunities that exist only in the realm of possibility. The world will continue to turn, bringing distant places closer and familiar places into new perspective. But tonight, as the sun sets over water that stretches toward lands she may never see, as the last light fades and the stars emerge to guide travelers across the dark sea, the trader's daughter will count her coins and calculate her profits, will plan her next investments and dream her next dreams, will find in the intersection of the practical and the visionary, the familiar and the foreign, the safe and the dangerous, a life that is uniquely her own. Different types of journeys call to different types of hearts. Physical journeys across oceans and continents, spiritual journeys into the depths of the soul, emotional journeys through the landscapes of love and loss and discovery. The trader's daughter has learned that the most important journey is not to any particular destination, but towards the fullest possible understanding of what it means to be human in a world that is both smaller and larger than we can imagine. In the great hall where shadows dance with firelight and silence holds its breath between the verses of ancient songs, a voice rises clear and strong above the murmur of conversation, the clink of drinking horns, the rustle of fine clothes and the soft footsteps of servants moving through the gathered crowd. It is a woman's voice, trained and tested, carrying within its notes the power to transform mere words into magic, simple stories into immortal truths, ordinary moments into memories that will outlive the stones themselves. She stands before the assembled company, warriors and nobles, merchants and craftsmen, wives and daughters and servants, all united now in their attention to the spell she weaves with nothing more than voice and verse, rhythm and rhyme, the ancient art of the Skald who shapes reality through the power of skilled speech. Her words rise and fall like waves upon the shore, carrying listeners away from the familiar world of daily concerns, into realms where gods walk among mortals, where heroes face impossible choices, where love and honor dance their eternal dance across the stage of human experience. But this is not merely entertainment, though it entertains. This is not simply performance, though it performs. This is the sacred act of cultural creation, the moment when a society looks into the mirror of story and sees itself reflected back, transformed, clarified, elevated to its highest possibilities. The Skald is not just telling stories, she is creating the stories that will shape how her people understand themselves, their values, their place in the cosmic order of things. Listen to the rhythm of her words, the careful construction of each line, the way she builds tension and releases it, the way she uses repetition and variation to create patterns that lodge themselves in memory like seeds in fertile soil. She is working within a tradition that stretches back generations, following rules and conventions that have been refined by countless predecessors. But she is also innovating, adding her own voice to the eternal conversation, contributing her own vision to the collective understanding of what it means to be human. The hall falls silent except for her voice, for the crackle of the fire, for the occasional intake of breath from listeners caught up in the unfolding drama of her tale. She tells them of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, but her version emphasizes not just his courage, but his capacity for love, his willingness to sacrifice glory for the sake of those he cherishes. She sings of Brynhild the Valkyrie, but her portrayal focuses not just on her supernatural powers, but on her very human struggles with duty and desire, loyalty and independence. What is the difference between being remembered and being immortal? The Skald understands that the answer lies in the quality of the stories told, the depth of the truths revealed, the power of the language used to preserve and transmit experience across the generations. She knows that her words have the power to make the temporary permanent, to transform the mortal into the eternal, to ensure that the values and wisdom of her people will survive long after the last of them has turned to dust. But she also knows that this power comes with tremendous responsibility. The stories she tells will shape how future generations understand their ancestors, their heritage, their own possibilities and limitations. If she portrays women as weak and passive, future women may believe that weakness and passivity are their natural state. If she shows men as nothing more than brutal warriors, future men may think that brutality is their only option. If she presents life as meaningless struggle, future generations may lose hope. If she makes it seem too easy, they may be unprepared for real challenges. And so she chooses her words carefully, weighs each image and metaphor, considers not just the immediate effect on her current audience, but the long-term impact on the cultural memory of her people. She seeks to inspire without misleading, to entertain without trivializing, to preserve without falsifying, to honor the past while opening possibilities for the future. The archaeological record shows us tantalizing glimpses of women who might have been skalds, elaborate grave goods that suggest high status and cultural importance, runic inscriptions that might be poetic compositions, artistic objects that demonstrate sophisticated aesthetic sensibility. The literary record is more generous but also more complex, preserving the names and works of some female poets, while undoubtedly losing many others to the selective nature of cultural memory. But regardless of how many women actually served as professional skalds, it is clear that women participated actively in the creation and preservation of Norse culture through their roles as storytellers, songmakers, keepers of genealogical memory, and transmitters of traditional knowledge. In the domestic sphere, around the hearth, and in the women's quarters, they told the stories that shaped children's understanding of their world, preserved the family histories that connected individuals to their ancestral heritage, and maintained the cultural continuity that allowed Norse society to survive and thrive across generations. Watch her now as she reaches the climax of her performance, her voice rising in power and passion, her gestures becoming more dramatic, her entire being focused on the moment when the hero must choose between safety and honor, between love and duty, between the easy path and the right path. The audience leans forward, caught up in the tension, invested in the outcome, even though they know the story, even though they have heard it told 100 times before. Because the power of the skilled Skald lies not in surprise but in revelation, not in novelty but in the renewed recognition of eternal truths. She does not simply recite the traditional version of the tale, but breathes new life into it with her interpretation, her emphasis, her unique understanding of what the story means and why it matters. Through her voice, ancient heroes become contemporary guides, mythological events become parables for modern choices, legendary figures become mirrors in which her listeners can see their own struggles and aspirations reflected. The fire burns lower as her tale winds toward its conclusion, but no one moves to add more wood, no one dares to break the spell that holds the hall in thrall. She speaks now of the hero's death, not as an ending but as a transformation, not as defeat but as the ultimate victory of spirit over flesh, of meaning over mortality, of love over loss. Her words carry the weight of all the heroes who have fallen, all the sacrifices that have been made, all the love that has transcended death through the power of memory and story. And in this moment, something magical happens. The boundary between performer and audience dissolves, between past and present, between story and reality. The listeners become participants in the tale, inheritors of its wisdom, guardians of its truth. They understand that they too are characters in an ongoing story, that their own lives will someday be the subject of songs and tales, that their own choices and actions will either add to the honor of their people or diminish it. The Skald's art is the ultimate rebellion against time and death, the assertion that some things, beauty, truth, love, courage, honor, are too precious to be allowed to perish with the flesh that first embodied them. Through the magic of words, she makes the temporary permanent, the mortal immortal, the individual universal. She transforms personal experience into collective wisdom, private pain into public understanding, individual triumph into communal inspiration. But she also understands that her art is fragile, dependent on the continued interest and participation of her audience, vulnerable to the changes in taste and technology that can make entire cultural traditions obsolete overnight. She knows that she is racing against time, trying to preserve in human memory what might otherwise be lost forever, trying to ensure that the stories that have shaped her people will continue to shape future generations. The skills required of a skald are formidable, not just technical mastery of verse forms and narrative structures, but deep knowledge of mythology and history, psychology and sociology, theology and philosophy. The skald must understand how stories work on multiple levels simultaneously, as entertainment and instruction, as preservation and innovation, as individual expression and cultural creation. She must know her audience intimately, their fears and hopes, their values and prejudices, their current concerns and eternal preoccupations. She must be able to read the mood of a room and adjust her performance accordingly, to sense when her listeners need to be comforted and when they need to be challenged, when they need to be reminded of their heritage, and when they need to be pushed toward new possibilities. And perhaps most importantly, she must have the courage to speak truth to power, to tell the stories that need to be told, even when they are difficult or unpopular, to preserve the full complexity of human experience, rather than simply the sanitized version that people might prefer to remember. The greatest skalds are not those who simply tell people what they want to hear, but those who help them understand what they need to know. As her performance draws to a close, as the final verses ring out in the smoky air of the great hall, as the last echoes fade into the contemplative silence that follows great art, the skald knows that she has accomplished something precious and precarious. She has taken the raw material of human experience and transformed it into something that will outlast the immediate moment, something that will continue to teach and inspire long after her own voice has been stilled. The audience stirs slowly back to ordinary consciousness, but they carry with them now something they did not have before, a renewed sense of their own dignity and possibility, a deeper understanding of the values that define their culture, a stronger connection to the ancestral wisdom that has guided their people through countless generations of challenge and change. Through echoing verses and haunting melodies, through the magic of skilled speech and the power of profound understanding, the skald has done what only art can do. She has allowed ordinary people to touch eternity, to participate, however briefly, in the realm of the immortal, to understand that they too are part of something larger and more enduring than their own brief individual existence. What survives when the last song has been sung? What endures when the final story has been told? The skald knows that the answer depends partly on her skill in creating works that lodge themselves so deeply in cultural memory that they become part of the very DNA of her people, and partly on forces beyond her control, the accidents of history, the changes in technology, the shifts in values and interests that determine which parts of the past will be preserved and which will be forgotten. But she also knows that the act of creation itself is worthwhile regardless of its ultimate fate, that the moment of connection between artist and audience, the instant of recognition when truth is revealed through beauty, the flash of understanding that illuminates the human condition, these moments have value in themselves, independent of their preservation or loss. As the evening continues and normal conversation gradually resumes, as the spell of the performance slowly dissipates and people return to their ordinary concerns, the skald quietly gathers her belongings and prepares to move on to the next hall, the next audience, the next opportunity to practice her ancient art. She knows that she will probably be forgotten long before her stories are, that her name will fade while the tales she tells continue to be told by others who may not even remember where they first heard them. But this knowledge does not discourage her. If anything, it liberates her from the burden of ego, from the need to be personally remembered, allowing her to focus entirely on the work itself, the sacred task of preserving and transmitting the wisdom of her people, the joyful challenge of finding new ways to tell old truths, the ongoing responsibility of shaping the stories that will shape the future. Art is indeed the ultimate rebellion against time and death, and the Skald is its willing soldier, its dedicated practitioner, its faithful guardian. Through her voice, the dead continue to speak to the living, the past continues to inform the present, and the eternal continues to manifest itself in the temporal world of human experience. The song ends, but the music plays on. The story concludes, but the truth it contains lives forever. The Skald falls silent, but somewhere, someone who heard her perform tonight will repeat her words to their own children, and those children will pass them on to their children, and the endless chain of cultural transmission will continue, carrying forward into an unknown future the distilled wisdom of countless generations who understood that some things are too important to be allowed to die. The morning mist swirls around the wooden posts of a new church, rising beside an ancient grove where the old sacred trees still stand but no longer receive the offerings that once hung from their branches like prayers made visible. The sound of hammers and saws mingles with the distant echo of church bells, creating a symphony of change that speaks of old certainties giving way to new uncertainties, familiar rituals being replaced by foreign practices, ancestral wisdom being challenged by imported truth. Standing at the edge of this transformation, watching the slow but inexorable tide of change wash over the landscape of her people's souls, is a woman whose life spans the bridge between two worlds. She remembers when the grove was the center of sacred activity, when the Völva's voice carried more authority than any priest's, when the old gods walked openly among their people, and the boundaries between the natural and supernatural were as fluid as water. But she also sees the future taking shape in the rising walls of the church, in the cross that will soon crown its roof, in the new ceremonies that will replace the old ones, in the different stories that will be told to explain the mysteries of existence and the proper way to live a human life. She understands that she is witnessing not just a change in religion, but a transformation of everything: law and custom, art and literature, family structure and social organization, the very conception of what it means to be a person in relationship to the divine. Listen to the voices of change carried on the wind, the chanting of monks who have traveled from distant monasteries to bring the new faith to the north, the heated discussions between those who embrace the new way and those who cling to the old, the careful negotiations between kings who seek political advantage and bishops who seek spiritual conquest, the whispered prayers of individuals trying to decide which god to trust with their soul's salvation. For the women of the Norse world, Christianity brought a complex mixture of loss and opportunity, restriction and liberation, continuity and disruption. On one hand, the new faith challenged many of the sources of female authority in the old system. The Völva's prophetic powers were redefined as dangerous sorcery. The goddess worship that had given women divine role models was replaced by a masculine trinity. The flexible marriage and divorce laws that had protected women's interests were superseded by more restrictive Christian doctrines. But on the other hand, Christianity also opened new possibilities for female participation in religious life, offered new models of female sanctity and authority, provided new institutions where women could find education and influence. The monastery and convent system, while imposing its own restrictions, also created spaces where women could pursue intellectual and spiritual goals independent of marriage and motherhood. The Christian emphasis on the soul's equality before God, regardless of gender, provided a theological foundation for arguing for women's spiritual dignity even when their social equality remained limited. Watch her as she navigates this changing landscape, this woman who has lived through the transformation from old ways to new. She attends the Christian services when required by law or social expectation, learns the new prayers and rituals, teaches her children the stories of Christ and the saints. But in the privacy of her own heart, in the quiet moments when no one is watching, she sometimes still whispers the old prayers, still recognizes the sacred presence in grove and stream, still carries within her the wisdom that her grandmother passed down through generations of women who understood the world differently. She is not unique in this complex relationship to religious change. Throughout the Norse world, the conversion to Christianity was a gradual process that took centuries to complete, a layered transformation where new beliefs were often laid over old ones rather than replacing them entirely. Many people maintained dual loyalties, dual practices, dual ways of understanding the sacred that allowed them to participate in the new system while preserving aspects of the old one. But for women, this religious transition was particularly complicated because it coincided with broader changes in social structure and legal systems that often worked to reduce their autonomy and authority. The Christian emphasis on male religious leadership meant that women lost many of the formal roles they had enjoyed in the old religious system. The new marriage laws, influenced by Christian theology, often made divorce more difficult and gave husbands greater authority over their wives' property and choices. Yet women found ways to adapt, to carve out new sources of influence and meaning within the Christian framework. They became patrons of churches and monasteries, using their wealth and social position to support religious institutions, and thereby gained spiritual authority. They embraced the Christian ideal of female sanctity, finding in the stories of female saints and martyrs new models for understanding their own spiritual potential. They used the Christian emphasis on charity and service to justify expanding their activities beyond the purely domestic sphere. The transition also created new tensions within families and communities. Mothers who had been raised in the old ways had to decide how much of their traditional knowledge to pass on to daughters who would live entirely within the Christian system. Wives who converted to Christianity sometimes found themselves in conflict with husbands who remained loyal to the old gods. Communities split along religious lines, with some members embracing change while others resisted it, creating divisions that could last for generations. When the world changes, do we change with it or preserve what was? Can we do both? These questions haunted every woman who lived through the religious transformation of the North. Some chose adaptation, throwing themselves wholeheartedly into the new faith, learning its ways and embracing its promises. Others chose preservation, maintaining the old practices in secret, passing down the ancient wisdom to children and grandchildren who might never fully understand its significance but would carry it forward nonetheless. But many chose a more complex path, finding ways to honor both old and new, to preserve what was valuable from the past while embracing what was promising about the future. They developed syncretic practices that blended Christian and pagan elements, created new interpretations of Christian doctrine that incorporated Norse values and concepts, found in the stories of Christ and the saints' echoes of their own ancestral heroes and heroines. The carved stones that mark this transitional period tell the story of this complex religious evolution. Christian crosses stand alongside runic inscriptions that invoke Thor's protection. Churches are built on the sites of pagan temples, sometimes incorporating the older sacred architecture into the new structures. Christian symbols are combined with traditional Norse motifs in art and decoration, creating hybrid forms that speak to the hybrid nature of the religious experience itself. And in the women's quarters, in the spaces where mothers taught daughters and grandmothers shared their memories with granddaughters, the old knowledge persisted in modified forms. The herb lore that had once been part of pagan ritual became Christian folk medicine. The prophetic traditions that had belonged to the Völva were transformed into Christian mysticism and visionary experiences. The goddess figures that had once provided female divine role models were replaced by the Virgin Mary and female saints who offered different but still powerful examples of female spiritual authority. As the wooden church rises higher and the cross is finally mounted on its roof, as the first Christian services are held and the new prayers echo in the space where different prayers once rang out, the woman who has witnessed this transformation feels the complex emotions of all who live through periods of profound change. There is loss for the certainties that once seemed eternal, for the beauty and meaning of the old ways, for the sense of connection to ancestral wisdom that had provided guidance and comfort for countless generations. But there is also anticipation for the new possibilities that the Christian faith might offer, for the different ways of understanding the sacred that might prove equally valid and meaningful, for the chance to participate in a larger community of believers that extends far beyond the boundaries of the local tribe or nation. The mist continues to swirl around the old grove and the new church, around the ancient trees and the rising walls, around the sacred stones that have witnessed the prayers of countless generations and will witness countless more. Change is indeed the only constant, but adaptation is survival, and the women who navigate these transformations with wisdom and grace ensure that something essential survives the transition, that the best of what was combines with the promise of what might be to create something new and valuable. When old gods fade, new gods rise. When familiar rituals lose their meaning, new ceremonies take their place. When traditional sources of authority are challenged, new forms of influence emerge. The tide of change cannot be stopped, but it can be navigated, and those who learn to read its currents and work with its power rather than against it often find themselves carried towards shores they never could have reached on their own. The bells ring out across the landscape, calling people to new forms of worship, new ways of understanding their relationship to the divine, new answers to the eternal questions that every generation must ask and answer for itself. The old ways fade, but do not disappear entirely, living on in modified forms, in half-remembered stories, in practices that continue even when their original meanings have been forgotten or transformed. And the women who lived through this great transformation, who served as bridges between the old world and the new, who found ways to preserve what was precious while embracing what was promising, become themselves part of the eternal story of human adaptation and survival, proof that the human spirit is resilient enough to find meaning and purpose, even in times of great uncertainty and change. The wind whispers through the empty doorways of what was once the greatest hall in all the northern lands, where kings held court and Skalds sang their songs, where warriors boasted of their deeds and women ruled their households with quiet authority. Now the roof beams have fallen, the carved pillars lie broken on grass-grown floors, and the only voices that remain are the ghosts of memory and the sighs of time itself as it counts the years since the last fire burned on the central hearth. Stand here in the ruins and listen to the silence, not the mere absence of sound, but the profound quiet that speaks of endings, of stories concluded, of chapters closed in the great book of human history. This is where the saga ends, not with dramatic battles or cosmic catastrophes, but with the simple, inexorable passage of time that transforms even the mightiest halls into archaeological curiosities, even the most stirring tales into fragmentary manuscripts, even the strongest voices into echoes that grow fainter with each passing generation. The grass grows thick and green, where once the feet of jarls and thralls, nobles and servants, warriors and merchants walked on packed earth. Wild flowers bloom in the corners, where once treasure chests stood, where once the household gods watched over the family's fortune, where once women sat spinning and weaving while keeping one ear tuned to the conversations of men planning raids and alliances, marriages and feuds. But what ended here was not just a building or even a way of life, but an entire cosmos, a complete worldview that made sense of existence in terms of gods and giants, of word and honor, of kinship bonds and blood feuds, of the eternal struggle between order and chaos, light and darkness, life and death. The Norse universe was not just a physical realm, but a moral and spiritual landscape where every action had cosmic significance, where individual choices rippled outward to affect the fate of gods and mortals alike. The great halls stand empty now because the culture that created them no longer exists. The gods have been forgotten or transformed into folklore figures, stripped of their power to inspire devotion or terror. The complex kinship systems that once determined everything from marriage partners to inheritance rights have given way to different forms of social organization. The values that once seemed as eternal as the stars, honor and courage, loyalty and vengeance, the intricate calculations of gift-giving and debt-settling that bound communities together, have been replaced by new values, new ways of understanding what makes life meaningful and worthwhile. Yet something remains. Walk through these ruins with eyes trained to see beyond the obvious, and you will find traces of the vanished world everywhere. The foundation stones that still mark the corners of rooms where families gathered for warmth and safety. The remnants of cooking hearths where women transformed raw ingredients into nourishment and comfort. The fragments of carved wood and worked metal that speak of artistic traditions that valued beauty alongside utility, decoration alongside function. Archaeological excavations reveal the layers of life that accumulated here over centuries, the detritus of daily existence that tells more accurate stories than any saga ever could. The broken combs and twisted brooches that speak of personal vanity and family pride. The gaming pieces and children's toys that remind us that even in the harsh northern climate, people found time for play and pleasure. The imported goods from distant lands that testify to the reach of trade networks, and the hunger for luxury and novelty that seems to be universal in human societies. But perhaps the most poignant traces of the vanished world are the most ephemeral ones, the cultural practices and beliefs that existed only in living memory, that died when the last person who remembered them drew their final breath, the specific intonation of prayers that were never written down, the precise steps of dances that were learned by imitation and lost when there was no one left to imitate. The nuanced understanding of social relationships and obligations that governed behavior but could not be captured in laws or formal documents. All things pass, only stories remain, even stories fade. This truth, which the Norse understood as well as any people who ever lived, is written in every crumbling stone of the abandoned halls, every silence where once there was laughter and argument and song. The sagas themselves, those magnificent works of literature that preserved some portion of the Norse worldview for future generations, are fragmentary survivors of a much larger oral tradition that has been lost forever. What survives are pieces, shadows, reflections of a complex and sophisticated culture that once seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves. The legal documents that recorded property transfers and legal disputes give us glimpses of how the society was organized, but they cannot convey the emotional texture of relationships, the subtle negotiations of power and influence that shaped daily life. The archaeological evidence tells us what people owned and how they lived, but it cannot tell us what they dreamed of, what they feared, what they hoped for their children. And the women who once ruled these households, who once carried the keys of authority at their belts, who once wove the cloth and told the stories and made the decisions that kept families and communities functioning, where are their voices now? Some echo faintly in the sagas, filtered through the consciousness of later generations who may not have fully understood what they were preserving. Some whisper from the archaeological record, in the tools and ornaments and dwelling spaces that speak of lives lived with intelligence and purpose and skill. But, for the most part, they have joined the great silence, their individual stories merged with the larger story of their people. The wind continues to blow through the empty halls, carrying with it the seeds of new plants that will gradually obscure even the ruins themselves, returning the cleared land to forest, erasing the last physical traces of human habitation. In time, even the stones will be scattered, the foundations will be forgotten, and the only evidence that anyone ever lived here will be the occasional artifact turned up by some future farmer's plough. Yet, even in this ultimate dissolution, there is a kind of victory. The Norse understanding of fate included the recognition that all things must end, that even the gods themselves were not eternal, that the universe itself was destined for destruction and renewal in the great cycle of Ragnarök and rebirth. They lived with full awareness of mortality and transience, and this awareness gave their lives not less meaning but more. Every moment became precious because it was temporary. Every relationship became sacred because it was fragile. Every achievement became significant because it was won against the certainty of loss. In the end, the saga of the Norse people, and particularly of the women who helped to create and sustain their culture, is a meditation on the relationship between permanence and change, between individual significance and cosmic insignificance, between the desire to create something lasting and the acceptance that nothing lasts forever. They built their halls knowing they would fall, told their stories knowing they would be forgotten, lived their lives knowing they would die, and they did all of this not in spite of these truths but because of them. The greatest victory over time and death is not the denial of endings, but the creation of meaning within the boundaries of mortality. The Norse women who lived and loved and worked and worried in these halls achieved a kind of immortality, not by avoiding the common fate of all human beings, but by embracing it fully while creating lives that were worth living, relationships that were worth cherishing, achievements that were worth celebrating even if they were destined to be temporary. As the sun sets over the ruins and the shadows lengthen across the grass-grown floors, As the silence deepens and the last light fades from the broken walls, remember this: endings are not failures, but completions; not defeats, but fulfillments of the natural order that governs all existence. The Norse women who once called these halls home understood this truth in their bones, and in understanding it, they found the courage to live fully in the face of uncertainty, to love deeply despite the inevitability of loss, to create beauty and meaning and joy even in a world that promised them nothing except the certainty that everything they cherished would eventually pass away. Their voices have fallen silent, but their example speaks still to anyone willing to listen. In a universe where all things must end, the only true victory is to live with such integrity and passion and purpose that the ending, when it comes, feels not like a defeat, but like the natural conclusion to a story worth telling, a life worth living, a saga worth remembering, until memory itself fades into the eternal silence from which all stories come, and to which all stories must return. The wind whispers through the empty doorways of what was once the greatest hall in all the northern lands, where kings held court and Skalds sang their songs, where warriors boasted of their deeds and women ruled their households with quiet authority. Now the roof beams have fallen, the carved pillars lie broken on grass-grown floors, and the only voices that remain are the ghosts of memory and the sighs of time itself as it counts the years since the last fire burned on the central hearth. Stand here in the ruins and listen to the silence, not the mere absence of sound, but the profound quiet that speaks of endings, of stories concluded, of chapters closed in the great book of human history. This is where the saga ends, not with dramatic battles or cosmic catastrophes, but with the simple, inexorable passage of time that transforms even the mightiest halls into archaeological curiosities, even the most stirring tales into fragmentary manuscripts, even the strongest voices into echoes that grow fainter with each passing generation. The grass grows thick and green where once the feet of jarls and thralls, nobles and servants, warriors and merchants walked on packed earth. Wild flowers bloom in the corners where once treasure chests stood, where once the household gods watched over the family's fortune, where once women sat spinning and weaving, while keeping one ear tuned to the conversations of men planning raids and alliances, marriages and feuds. But what ended here was not just a building or even a way of life, but an entire cosmos, a complete worldview that made sense of existence in terms of gods and giants, of word and honor, of kinship bonds and blood feuds, of the eternal struggle between order and chaos, light and darkness, life and death. The Norse universe was not just a physical realm, but a moral and spiritual landscape where every action had cosmic significance, where individual choices rippled outward to affect the fate of gods and mortals alike. The great halls stand empty now, because the culture that created them no longer exists. The gods have been forgotten or transformed into folklore figures, stripped of their power to inspire devotion or terror. The complex kinship systems that once determined everything from marriage partners to inheritance rights have given way to different forms of social organization. The values that once seemed as eternal as the stars, honor and courage, loyalty and vengeance, the intricate calculations of gift-giving and debt settling that bound communities together, have been replaced by new values, new ways of understanding what makes life meaningful and worthwhile. Yet something remains. Walk through these ruins with eyes trained to see beyond the obvious, and you will find traces of the vanished world everywhere. The foundation stones that still mark the corners of rooms where families gathered for warmth and safety. The remnants of cooking hearths where women transformed raw ingredients into nourishment and comfort. The fragments of carved wood and worked metal that speak of artistic traditions that valued beauty alongside utility, decoration alongside function. Archaeological excavations reveal the layers of life that accumulated here over centuries, the detritus of daily existence that tells more accurate stories than any saga ever could. The broken combs and twisted brooches that speak of personal vanity and family pride. The gaming pieces and children's toys that remind us that even in the harsh northern climate, people found time for play and pleasure. The imported goods from distant lands that testify to the reach of trade networks and the hunger for luxury and novelty that seems to be universal in human societies. But perhaps the most poignant traces of the vanished world are the most ephemeral ones, the cultural practices and beliefs that existed only in living memory, that died when the last person who remembered them drew their final breath, the specific intonation of prayers that were never written down, the precise steps of dances that were learned by imitation and lost when there was no one left to imitate, the nuanced understanding of social relationships and obligations that governed behavior but could not be captured in laws or formal documents. All things pass, only stories remain, even stories fade. This truth, which the Norse understood as well as any people who ever lived, is written in every crumbling stone of the abandoned halls, every silence where once there was laughter and argument and song. The sagas themselves, those magnificent works of literature that preserved some portion of the Norse worldview for future generations, are fragmentary survivors of a much larger oral tradition that has been lost forever. What survives are pieces, shadows, reflections of a complex and sophisticated culture that once seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves. The legal documents that recorded property transfers and legal disputes give us glimpses of how the society was organized, but they cannot convey the emotional texture of relationships, the subtle negotiations of power and influence that shaped daily life. The archaeological evidence tells us what people owned and how they lived, but it cannot tell us what they dreamed of, what they feared, what they hoped for their children. And the women who once ruled these households, who once carried the keys of authority at their belts, who once wove the cloth and told the stories and made the decisions that kept families and communities functioning, where are their voices now? Some echo faintly in the sagas, filtered through the consciousness of later generations who may not have fully understood what they were preserving. Some whisper from the archaeological record, in the tools and ornaments and dwelling spaces that speak of lives lived with intelligence and purpose and skill. But for the most part, they have joined the great silence, their individual stories merged with the larger story of their people, their personal struggles and triumphs dissolved into the collective memory that becomes myth, that becomes legend, that becomes nothing more than archaeological curiosity for people who cannot imagine what it would have been like to live in a world where the gods were real and honor was more important than life, and the bonds of kinship determined almost everything about your identity and prospects. In the quiet hour between sleeping and waking, between the last dream and the first conscious thought, between the ancient past and the uncertain future, a woman stands before a mirror that reflects not just her face, but the faces of all the women who came before her. all the struggles and triumphs that have led to this moment, all the possibilities that stretch ahead into tomorrow and beyond. Look closely at her reflection, and you will see something extraordinary. The same questions that haunted the Völva as she prepared for her journey between worlds. The same calculations that occupied the housewife as she counted her keys and planned her household's survival. The same fierce protectiveness that burned in the heart of the mother. She is a woman of the 21st century, surrounded by technologies that would seem like magic to her Norse ancestors, living in a world of opportunities and freedoms that medieval women could barely imagine. Yet when she looks into the mirror of her own soul, when she examines the deepest questions of her existence, she finds that the landscape of the human heart has not changed as much as the landscape of the physical world. She still wrestles with the ancient tension between independence and connection, between personal ambition and family responsibility, between the desire to protect those she loves and the need to prepare them for challenges she cannot anticipate or prevent. She still seeks to find meaning and purpose in a universe that offers no guarantees, to create beauty and order in the face of chaos and uncertainty, to build something lasting in a world where everything is subject to change and loss. The mirror shows her the trader's daughter counting foreign coins, calculating the profit margins that will justify the risks of long-distance commerce, dreaming of distant shores while managing the responsibilities that anchor her to familiar ground. But it also shows her the modern woman navigating global markets, international relationships, career opportunities that span continents, trying to balance her hunger for exploration and achievement with her commitment to family and community. Are we so different from them? Are they so different from us? The questions echo across the centuries, bridging the gap between the medieval hall and the modern boardroom, between the Norse woman spinning wool by candlelight and the contemporary woman typing emails by the glow of her computer screen, between the ancient mother teaching her children the family genealogies and the modern mother helping her children navigate the complexities of identity and belonging in a multicultural world. The technology has changed, the opportunities have expanded, the legal framework has evolved to provide greater protection and equality. But the fundamental challenges of being human remain remarkably consistent across time and culture. How do you maintain your individual identity while forming meaningful connections with others? How do you balance competing responsibilities and loyalties? How do you find your own voice while honoring the wisdom of those who came before you? How do you prepare for an uncertain future while fully living in the present moment? Watch the modern woman as she moves through her day, and you will see echoes of all her Norse ancestors. Like the Völva, she seeks wisdom and understanding, trying to make sense of complex situations, to see patterns and possibilities that others might miss, to offer guidance and insight to those who seek her counsel. Like the housewife, she manages resources and relationships, making countless decisions that affect the well-being of those she loves, wielding authority that is often invisible but nonetheless real. Like the warrior woman, she fights battles, perhaps not with sword and shield, but with determination and courage, standing up for what she believes in, protecting those who depend on her, refusing to accept limitations based on others' expectations or prejudices. Like the mother, she nurtures and teaches, passing on values and knowledge to the next generation, trying to prepare her children for challenges she cannot fully anticipate. Like the widow, she learns to find strength in adversity, to rebuild when life tears down what she has built, to discover resources within herself that she never knew she possessed. Like the grandmother, she becomes a keeper of memory and wisdom, a bridge between past and future, a repository of experience that can guide and comfort those who are still learning to navigate the complexities of existence. Like the trader, she participates in networks that span the globe, engaging with people and cultures that broaden her perspective and challenge her assumptions, finding ways to explore the wider world while maintaining her connections to home and family. Like the Skald, she tells stories, perhaps not in verse and song, but in the countless ways that modern people shape narrative and meaning, create content and communication, preserve experience, and pass on understanding. The specific forms change, but the underlying patterns persist. Women today still struggle with the balance between strength and tenderness, still navigate the complex terrain of love and law, still seek to create homes that are both sanctuaries and launching pads for those they love. They still face the challenge of being taken seriously in male-dominated fields, still work to have their voices heard and their contributions recognized, still fight against stereotypes and limitations that would confine them to narrow roles and restricted possibilities. But they also inherit the legacy of all the women who came before them, the accumulated wisdom of generations who faced similar challenges with courage and creativity, who found ways to expand the definition of what women could be and do, who refused to accept that biology determines destiny, or that tradition cannot be changed, or that the future must simply repeat the patterns of the past. The Norse women who lived in a world of ice and fire, who made their choices within the constraints of their time and culture, who found ways to exercise power and authority despite the limitations placed upon them. These women blazed trails that subsequent generations could follow and expand upon. Their insistence on their own dignity and worth, their refusal to be passive objects in their own lives, their determination to make their voices heard and their influence felt, created possibilities that future women could build upon and extend. Some truths are eternal. The human heart remembers what the mind forgets. Across the centuries and across the cultures, certain patterns repeat themselves because they reflect fundamental aspects of human nature and human need. The desire for autonomy and connection, for security and adventure, for individual expression and communal belonging. These are not historical curiosities, but ongoing aspects of the human condition that each generation must work out for itself. The modern woman looking into the mirror sees not just her own reflection, but the reflection of all the women who have stood at similar crossroads, who have faced similar choices, who have struggled with similar questions about identity and purpose, love and work, tradition and innovation. She sees the continuity that connects her to her ancestors, and the possibility that her own choices and actions will influence and inspire future generations. And in seeing this continuity, she finds both humility and empowerment. Humility, because she recognizes that her struggles are not unique, that countless others have walked similar paths and faced similar challenges, that she is part of a larger story that began long before her birth and will continue long after her death. Empowerment, because she understands that she carries within herself the accumulated strength and wisdom of all who came before her, that their victories have made her victories possible, that their courage has opened doors through which she can walk. The eternal return is not a repetition, but a recognition. The understanding that certain aspects of human experience transcend time and culture, that certain truths remain constant even as the surface details of life change dramatically, that the deepest questions of existence require each generation to find its own answers while drawing upon the wisdom of all previous generations. As the woman turns away from the mirror and toward the day that awaits her, as she prepares to face whatever challenges and opportunities lie ahead, she carries with her not just her own hopes and fears, but the hopes and fears of all the women who have ever lived. She is not alone, even when she feels alone. She is not the first to face these choices, even when the choices feel unprecedented. She is not without guidance, even when the way forward seems unclear. In every woman's heart burns the same fire that warmed the Norse halls, the same light that guided the Völva through her visions, the same strength that enabled the housewife to manage her complex responsibilities, the same love that motivated the mother to sacrifice for her children, the same resilience that allowed the widow to rebuild her life, the same wisdom that enabled the grandmother to pass on her knowledge, the same adventurous spirit that called to the trader's daughter, the same creative. The names change, the circumstances evolve, the opportunities expand or contract, but the essential spirit remains constant, the determination to live fully and authentically, to make choices based on values rather than fears, to create meaning and beauty and connection in the face of uncertainty and change, to leave the world somehow better for having been part of it. You are stronger than you know. You are braver than you believe. You are more beloved than you can imagine. These words, whispered by the Völva across the centuries, spoken by every woman who has ever found the courage to face the unknown, echoing in the voice of every mother who has ever blessed her children, ring as true today as they did in the firelit halls of the ancient North. The saga continues. The story never ends. The eternal return brings each woman back to the same fundamental questions and forward to the same essential task: to discover who she truly is, to live according to her deepest values, to love and be loved, to contribute to the ongoing human project of creating meaning and beauty and hope in a universe that offers no guarantees except the promise that every ending is also a beginning. In the beginning, there was ice and fire, and there still is,